Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Allred, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar will be on December 8th, Where to Start When You Don't Know Where to Start with Catherine Grant. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on starting your search for your immigrant ancestors. James Tanner, 17 years as a family history volunteer, presently serving at the BYU Family History Library on the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association. He has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. James, if you're ready to have, or if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, sounds great. I'm glad to be here this evening. We're going to share my screen. How about starting with that? That would work. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. We're going to talk about starting a search for immigrant ancestors. Now, there's a couple of things that everyone should recognize about this. And the most important thing is that here in the United States, we're all immigrants. Everyone came from someplace else. And so there is an inevitable, it's 100% almost on, well, and even if you are an American-born person, you're still the descendants of immigrants. So basically, it's inevitable as you go back on your family line that you will run into someone who came from a different country. Now, you're fortunate if they came from a country that speaks your same language, but if they didn't, that may be an overwhelming challenge to start out with. The next problem, of course, is that we need to know where the immigrant came from. So we'll talk about all of this and how do we get started going and from the very beginning. And as I guess the way to summarize it is that finding the immigrant ancestor is the most common challenge in genealogical research. I guess over the last year that I've been helping people with their genealogy, I would guess in the range of almost 80 to 90% of the people are looking for the immigrant. It's just the place where everyone gets to that point and has the challenge of determining if they can make the leap from the target country, from the arriving country, the United States, to another country. Now, generalizing this, it really doesn't matter because there are immigrants in almost every country of the world. And the immigrants that are there will eventually have to trace their ancestry back to someplace else in the world. So since the population of the world is highly movable, then you're going to find out that you need to be aware of this. So for an example, I have English ancestors, which is no surprise. And among those English ancestors, I found that some of those English ancestors came from the Netherlands. So suddenly I am no longer doing research in English, I am doing research in Dutch. So this is kind of the situation that occurs sooner or later as you go back in time. So let's look at some of the definitions. An immigrant is a person who arrives in a country with the intent of living there, who is not a citizen of that country. Now, the importance of this for genealogical purposes is that we are Probably as you're looking at it from the standpoint of, and I guess my perspective here in the United States, I'm saying my ancestors came to the United States. They were immigrants, and at the time they arrived in the United States, they were not citizens of the United States. So that's a legal issue. And the legal issue may create issues with the way that their lives were recorded, or that what kind of records they may have created at some point in their life. Some of those ancestors, and possibly all of them by now, obviously, would have become citizens of the United States and thereby obtained additional or provided to a genealogical researcher additional records that weren't there when they weren't a citizen of the United States. So one of the very basic ones, obviously, is an application for citizenship, which is known as an application for naturalization, and is a legal process that you go through. So that creates a record at that point. So as we view the immigrant process begins in the country that they are leaving, and there may be records created of the person as they leave that country, as they travel across whatever they had to do, crossed the border from Canada, came in from Mexico, came in through the ocean at one of the seaports, however they arrived in the United States. And then after that had occurred, there were additional records created that will allow us to backtrack up that immigrant line and find that immigrant. So there's another term out there, and leaving your own country to live in another country is called emigration. So you emigrate from the country and you immigrate into the country. And so if you're going to look for people who left a country, then you're looking for emigration records with an E. And then if you're looking for the country of arrival, you're looking for immigration records. And in many cases, they both exist. And there are countries that keep track of all the people, historically have kept track of people as they left the country, as well as people who arrived in the country. So we need some definitions when we're talking about immigration, and it's very important to focus on how these words work. A passport is an identification document given by your country of residence. So a person who arrived in the United States, for example, may have a passport, but the passport was issued in the country where they reside. So if they were coming from Germany, for example, to the United States, they would have some kind of identification document that was created in Germany. So from the standpoint of a genealogist, we have to think in terms of when these events occurred, when these steps occurred in each process of a person's life, what kinds of documents were created. And this is one of those documents. Now, the visa is a permit to enter a particular country for a specified period of time. So if you have a passport, in order to get into the United States, you would also need a visa, which is a permit to enter the country. Now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And if you're reading the news today, you'll find out that many countries are closing their borders to people coming into their country. In other words, they're shutting down this process of entering the country through a passport and a visa. Now, some countries historically have not required visas. For example, the European Union countries over in Europe, between the European countries, do not require a visa to travel between the different European Union countries. It's just like in the United States, we don't require visas for travel between states. Hopefully that never happens, because it would be very complicated if it did. An alien is a person who is not a citizen, simply by definition. So you're an alien is, as referred to in any record, particularly, for example, in United States Census records, is a person who's simply not a citizen. That doesn't have any reflection on who that person was or the status of that person. It's just a legal definition of someone who has not yet obtained citizenship. An immigrant is a person who's been granted permission to live permanently in the country. So if you become an immigrant, you actually are part of the country. That does not mean you're a citizen, but it means that you're allowed to live here indefinitely. The US has extremely complex laws about who can and cannot become an immigrant, and from where the people can come and how many people can come, and what are the conditions for their arrival, and what they can and can't do when they stay here, and how long can they stay here, and on and on. Every one of those conditions creates new records. And so basically, the more complicated the process from the standpoint of a legal process is, the better off we are as genealogists, because we get more records. And that's kind of a different way, you perhaps, of looking at all of these different things that happen out there. You may be absolutely opposed to every kind of record you can think of, but the rule of the law is that across the world is that people who move generate records. So there's that's just an important thing. Our job as genealogists is to not only identify those records, but then find them. And so we need to be able to know, where would they have kept these records? Where are these records kept that are generated when all these processes occur? Now, a non-immigrant is a person who has been given permission to reside temporarily in a country. So when you talk about people who are immigrants, the definition of an immigrant means that they're going to be here forever. They're not leaving, and unless they were forcibly removed, they would not be. They would almost be, and all of their descendants would be a part of the country. If a person is given a temporary visa or a temporary entrance permit, then that person would have to leave at the end of that permit. And if they don't leave, then they become an illegal or undocumented alien. It's a person who has no visa or does not have permission to enter the country and enters the country without a visa. So you need to be pretty clear at this. If you're worried about there being too many immigrants in any country, and that seems to be a common underlying theme about what happens to people as they move from country to country, you have to remember that a person who has immigrated already has permission to be there. It's not a matter of them coming and not being legitimately in the country. Okay, so here's a few more definitions. Naturalization is the process of admitting a non-citizen to citizenship of a country. And any country that has some kind of procedure for naturalization is basically allowing people to become in part of their country and have all of the benefits of being a citizen. Right now, for example, you may not be aware of it, but a lot of people around the world are seeking citizenship in their ancestral country of Italy. If they have Italian ancestors, Italy is basically in a situation where they have entire cities that have been abandoned by people leaving the country, and they are in a process right now of allowing people to get citizenship and come back and live in Italy if they want to do that. So there's all of these laws and all of these different states of not being a citizen or being a citizen can change over time. A foreign national is a person without U.S. citizenship or nationality. In other words, he isn't born here, he didn't get to be citizens, and they are called foreign nationals. A permanent resident is a person that's given permission to permanently reside, but is not a citizen. What's the difference between a permanent resident and an immigrant? An immigrant status means that they have that they become part of the country. A permanent resident is simply like someone living in a rental unit. They could be evicted because they are permanent residents. They've been given that status, but that doesn't mean that they're basically going to be able to stay here indefinitely. A refugee is a person outside of this whole system. It's a person who is unable or unwilling to return to a country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution based on the person's race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. Okay, when you read that statement, that is a legal statement that defines a refugee. So that is how a refugee comes and gains entry into a different country. They have to simply show that they come from a group of people or an individually. They have a fear that being in their country, they would not survive or they would be highly persecuted. If you want to understand this kind of, if you want to go through this terminology a little bit, many of my ancestors, for example, crossed the plains as what we call pioneers. They were people who left the east part of the country, and it came into, some of them came to Utah in 1847 and very shortly thereafter. At that time, where they were going was Mexico. And at that time, they were refugees. They had been persecuted and they crossed the country. So when you start to translate these terms into some kind of reality with your ancestors, you may begin to understand that sometimes we need to use a different term. When we understand the situation, for example, with the Mayflower people who came across on the Mayflower they initiated their voyage from the Netherlands, but came from England primarily, and some of them actually did come from the Netherlands, and came to America to escape religious persecution. They were refugees by this definition. Of course, there was no country here that was organized that was going to accept them in as citizens, and they unfortunately did not cooperate enough with the Indians to resolve any conflicts that there may have been. Okay, so immigration in the United States, let's give you an idea, and this is in the last few years, and so you may not really understand, but in 2015, we'll look at the bottom line down there, there were 43 million people in the United States whose category could be described as being immigrants. 43 million people. And that was 13% of the total US population. So 13% of our present population, more or less, it hasn't changed much since 2015. It may have increased slightly. But basically what we're talking about is an immigrant population that is a substantial part of what we have in the United States. And if we go back in time, that number goes up from 13% up to 100%, because everyone at some point in time is an immigrant. Now, if you start thinking, well, okay, but what about the Native Americans, the people that were here? Well, all of the information that we have about the Native American people in the American continent is that they were also immigrants. They just happened to get here a lot earlier than any of the immigrants who came from Europe directly. So this is a land of immigration. So we've got to look at as you go back in your research, you're going to get back, and I'm going to start with the distant past, assuming that your ancestors got here during colonial times from around the 1500s to the 1700s. You'll realize, of course, that from the immigrants who came from England, the ones that we generally looked to as being the ones who founded the country kind of thing, came in the 1600s, but there were many immigrants already here in America from Europe by the time that the Pilgrims came in 1620, because Columbus, of course, and the Spanish occupation of Central and South America and parts of North America began in the 1400s. So there was over 100 years of people from Europe coming to America by the time the English got here in any kind of numbers. So we have the Spanish in the Southwest and Florida. Some of the people, by the way, who live in the Southwest in Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California, and who are Spanish-speaking heritage people, who their ancestry goes back in America long before the United States. And it's interesting to go back and trace some of those ancestries there. It's very interesting. The French in the North in Canada were here long before there was a United States, and they were here essentially before the British came in any great numbers. And then arrived the British along the eastern coast and into Canada. And so these were that came in the beginning in the 1600s. And the big push, we'll see, came in the beginning of the 1600s. Any immigration policy was controlled by the country which claimed sovereignty. It's important to remember this, because when you're looking for records in the early colonies of the United States before there was a United States, before 1776, you have to constantly remind yourself that these people were living as British citizens and living as part of Great Britain, as part of England and the islands of the British Isles, and that they weren't citizens of the United States or of America. They were citizens of England and had the rights of English citizens, and the records were being kept in England as well as here locally in America. Okay, so those kind of things are things that you need to have kind of a concept of. And in the new nation, beginning in 1790 to 1820, this is in the 1790 census, the first US census that came, the English were the largest ethnic group, nearly 20, and they were by far, but nearly 20% were of African heritage. So 20% of the people living in America at the time of the Revolution and the time that the United States was established were African American people. They lived here in the what became the United States. The German, Scottish, and Irish were also well represented. And the census takers back in 1790 didn't count Native Americans. As a matter of fact, Native Americans did not become citizens of the United States until the 1920s. They weren't granted citizenship until around 1924. So you really kind of need to get into how all of this worked. So about 366,000 enslaved people were brought to North America beginning in the 1500s. This is the total amount that came. And in 1860, US federal census, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the United States by 1860. So when we begin to look at what happened in the United States, that is it is far different than the way that we have viewed our past. And migration of 1815 to 1865, we're going to look at this part of our migration. Most of these immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, and about 1/3 from Ireland. So this is where you usually begin to find you're begin to run into the immigrants, because it's around the mid to beginning of the 1800s is the point at which many of these people immigrated. Now, the exceptions, of course, are the enslaved people and the early British arrivals in primarily in New England and the northern part of the eastern coast. But immigration was going on all during that period of time, and so it's very possible that you'd be looking for immigrants clear back into the 1600s before you were going to try and find where they came from. Irish heritage is probably one of the, there's two main groups of people who came to America and who comprise the people who are now living here. They're the Germans, and there are about 43 million German people who are classified as Germans. They could have been coming from any number of different countries in Europe, but in the United States, if they spoke a language that sounded like German, they were counted as German. And so 43 million of them came from the area that spoke a German language. And Irish was next with 31.5 million people came from Irish heritage. So it's very common for people who are doing research to end up having to find the immigrant ancestor from Germany or from Ireland. And both of these areas present different but significant challenges to someone who is beginning their research and genealogical research and beginning to learn about what's necessary. Then from 1880 to 1930, there was the tremendous influx of people into the United States. And here's the fact that may be helpful to you, and I may have to repeat this in a minute, but basically the earliest immigration law in the United States was passed in 1882. It's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that means that was the only immigration law. And so basically, these people that were coming in came in before all of the immigration laws and restrictions were created, which, by the way, date primarily from around 1930. But there was another thing that happened in 1930, and that was the beginning of the Great Depression. And so conditions in the United States for a lot of the people were not much better than they were in Europe, and there was not as much of an incentive to come. So about 27 million people came through into the United States during those two dates, 1880 to 1930, and about 12 million of those entered through Ellis Island. Now, the more recent your immigrant, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to find more records and identify the location from which they came. That is because many of the records that were ultimately created about immigrants were created subsequent to the 1900s. So if your immigrant ancestor arrived in the United States in the 1900s, there are lots of records. Now, if you take this concept and put it into any other country out there, there's going to be the same kind of questions that need to be asked and the same kind of records. So if you chose a company for immigration, you would look at their immigration laws and you would find when were certain records required for immigration. They may have been required for hundreds of years. They may have been required for only a few years. So it just depends. And that's going to be the key to locating immigrants from any country to any country in the world. And it's important to also understand that every wave of immigrants has always resisted and persecuted the next wave. It did not matter who they were. They were persecuted because they were the immigrants, they were foreigners, and they did not deserve to have the same jobs and the same opportunities that we have, since we've been living here all our lives and we're the original people. Well, none of us were original people. And the answer is that yes, this happens in every year. It's still going on right today. There's no difference. So when did these restrictions, before 1880, anybody could simply walk across the border or land in a boat. So tracing an immigrant before 1880 becomes a considerably greater challenge than after 1880, because there's not necessarily any record of them arriving and or becoming a part of the country. They simply could have walked in or landed in a boat, and they didn't have to land in any big country. I finally traced my one immigrant line family who had come from Ireland by way of Canada. They came to the United States and landed in Pascaquoddy, Maine. And so sometimes it's an interesting problem and an interesting challenge. As I mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 imposed an immigration tax. So it started to restrict people who came. Alien contract labor laws of 1885 to 1887 imposed more restrictions. The US government began to process and accept or reject all immigrants in 1891. So it wasn't until close to the 1900s that they even began to try to identify everybody who came into the country. And so that was where we got where it began to be. To today, the immigration process is extremely complex. So first of all, we had one of the major ports. This is where the huge numbers of immigrants were coming. They were coming in through New York and New York City. And a lot of them stayed, which made the city of New York one of the larger cities in the world. But Castle Garden was the original entry point, and there were about 11 million immigrants during 1820 to 1892 when they were being processed through this particular portal into the United States. So it becomes pretty likely that you would look for a Castle Garden information. And here's the Castle Garden website, and it's a free database, and it contains 11 million records of immigrants who arrived from 1820 to 1892. So if you're starting your research, you can go on Castle Garden and see if you happen to find your immigrant ancestors. That would be kind of logical. Now the question is, just because they came through Castle Garden does not mean they lived in New York. They may have immediately left and gotten on a train and ridden a train out to any part of the country, or walked, or rode a horse or in a wagon and left and gone out to the rest of the country. So it's just where they came through. But here's one great portal for that. Ellis Island is the other, because Castle Garden was decommissioned and closed down, and they built a facility out on an island off Manhattan Island in New York, next to the island where is the Statue of Liberty. And Ellis Island operated from 1892 until 1954. So if your ancestors came through here, there are over 51 million immigrant passenger records, and they're together. They're all on the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, Inc. website. And you can go on there and look for the list of all of the immigrants. So there's kind of a leg up if your ancestors managed to come through either Ellis Island or through this through Castle Garden, because these are the places where there's fairly good, fairly extensive, and fairly accurate records. Now, what are some of the other issues? Of course, there's always the sort of underlying belief that the name of the immigrant was somehow changed when they came to the United States, or the government didn't like their name, so they changed it to something else. Well, that's not true at all. Basically, what it is that they had people had the option of changing their name, and they could have changed their name before they left the country they left from. And they could have done that for a variety of reasons. If they were trying to escape something in the country that they left, they may wanted to change their name simply so they wouldn't be found when they came to America. And the other thing is that some of the names did not go well with English. And so a lot of people changed their names that were complicated names that they came for the countries they came from, and perfectly acceptable, and felt like they wanted to fit in, and so they changed their names. And others did it for defensive purposes. If you had a name that was identifiably German, you maybe didn't want to be known as a German, and you learned English enough that no one knew that you weren't a German. Now, you've got to understand also, but that the enslaved people who were brought here did not have that advantage, because no matter what, they were given a different name. And they almost never retained their original names from Africa. And in addition to that, they were never free to do any of the things that the people who were not enslaved were given. So they're a completely different category of challenges in trying to find the ancestral lines. So it's important also to understand that just the passenger list and the immigration records may not tell you where that person originated. You may not be able to tell where they came from. They may say they came from Germany. Germany is a very complex concept. The American idea of Germany was that they were all Germans and they all lived in Germany. The answer was they were living in most of the time from the 1820s up to the 1950s in different separate countries, all of which spoke German language, but similar German languages, but were not technically Germany. So you really need to get into the geography and the history of Europe in order to begin to identify where your people may have come from. And there are also other ways they came into the country. Now, they began keeping Canadian border crossings and Mexican border crossings intermittently at first, and then later, as in the 1900s developed, they became more and more prevalent. And so there are Canadian and Mexican border crossing records that will be very assistant. I have identified on various occasions from the border crossing records have finally discovered where an immigrant came in from Mexico, where they originated, because they gave that information upon crossing the border. There are European immigration records, as I mentioned a moment ago. They are, depending on the country, there are records from say Hamburg, Germany, where they list all of the people who are emigrating from the country. Many other countries kept immigration records. Some of them have more records than others, and you need to investigate the country, the various countries where your immigrants came from, to determine whether or not the records exist. You will always begin your search for the immigrant in the country of arrival. It seems somehow logical, but it's really illogical, that if the person came from Germany, you're going to start to look for the person in Germany. Well, the problem is, it's like saying, I'm going to look for that person in the United States, and his name is Tom Smith. And you go, how many people with that name are there? Well, the answer is you cannot find the immigrant and accurately identify them without knowing the exact place where they began their journey to the United States. It's all the records of all genealogical records are arranged and cataloged and kept geographically. So in order to open the door to these genealogical records, you have to open the door geographically and know the locations. And this is really important when you have ancestors who came from places like Scandinavia, because the pool of names was very small comparatively. And the number of people with the same names is phenomenal. So what you do is you discover the immigrant trail backwards, starting with the most recent events in your ancestors' lives. So the most recent event may be a death record or a probate record, and then moving backwards, a marriage record, and then perhaps a birth record, but any other records that may have been created during their lifetime. And understanding that when the immigrant got employment, when they enrolled their children in school, when they attended any kind of, became a member of any kind of religious organization, it is very likely that those organizations recorded the origin of the immigrant and may have recorded the actual location where the person was born in that other country. So these are the records that we're looking for, not the records over in Europe, or not the records in Africa, or not the records in South America, but the records that are right here in the United States that may have had a record of their lives. And it's very important to believe, at least it's a belief, that that the origin can be found in some of these records. The one I always refer back to is one of my great-great-grandfathers, who was from Ireland, and he came from Northern Ireland. And as an immigrant from Northern Ireland, he was also a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and crossed the plains as a pioneer. His daughter was an avid genealogist, and she recorded where her father was born and the information about her father. The only thing wrong is that she recorded the information wrong. It was inaccurate. He was not from, and the place she recorded did not exist. So I spent years and years trying to find the immigrant. And the only way I did that was through a record that was created here in the United States, where he said where he was born at the time he got married. And that was recorded in his own hand, where he wrote it and where he wrote in where he was born. So this is, it's important that we understand that these are origin records. And point out that the US federal census records often tell us the country of origin, but they're not specific and they're not necessarily accurate. The person who was doing the census may have understood they were from Germany, but they may have not been from Germany. They may have been from some other country, and he only thought they were from Germany because he didn't understand, he or she did not understand the language. Naturalization papers, they can usually tell the immigration and whether or not they're naturalized, been filed. Some US censors tell us whether or not they've been naturalized. If they have been naturalized, that's an immediate key to go look for the naturalization records, regardless of where they're going to be located. So the next step is trying to find those naturalization records. Important date there is 1906. In 1906, all naturalizations were federalized into the federal court system. Before that time, they were in the state court systems, and they could be in a county court, they could be in the state court. It's another situation where you're going to be doing a lot of detective work. Passenger lists, and one of the largest collections of passenger lists, at least in the United States, is on Ancestry.com. And church records sometimes require notice from the previous church as to the church they left coming to America. This is not as impossible as it sounds, but it is often the case. For instance, if they were Catholics, the priest here would require that they brought a certificate from their previous parish in Europe and showed them that, and he would record that. And then if they did not have that, they would still have to know which country they came from, or the place they came from. But then they would have to take the catechism over again and in a sense, prove that they were good Catholics. So there's lots of these religious things that can create situations where the records were recorded. Now, one of the most important parts of the migration process in the United States is what we call the Great Migration. You might identify this with pilgrims and people that kind of look like this in this woodcut here, but they didn't look like that at all. And this is something that was basically fabricated by ad agencies over the years in the United States. So, but the Great Migration was important because almost 20,000 people came between 1620 and 1640. And the important part of that for genealogists is that there has been a very systematic and very extensive and comprehensive study done of all of those people and every last person they can find in every record that they have available. And it's almost everything is available here on the American Ancestors website. It's called the Great Migration Project, and it's online. It's not completely online yet, but it will be, and it's not even completely done yet. It's done from 1620 to 1630, and now they're extending it to 1640, identifying every person who came to America from into the New England. So it's in your New England area, you've got this fabulous resource. And the important thing to understand is we use what's called cluster research. Cluster research says, look at the neighbors, friends, and relatives of the person rather than just at the person themselves. Genealogists have a tendency to focus on the individual and keep looking for the name and looking for that person. And instead of doing that, they should be looking for all the siblings and all the children and all the parents and everyone else who lived in that time period, because the records may have been kept for any one of those people. Their next door neighbors on the census records could possibly have come from the same exact place they did. People had a tendency to gather in groups of people who were interrelated or came from the same area in Europe and in the other places in the world. So we search all the family members, look for neighbors, friends, and from the census and church records, and look for business records. Don't forget, people still had to fill out forms even back into the 1600s to do things, and those forms are often preserved, and they're often not identified as genealogical records. They're simply business records. Oh yeah, well, the business records are in the Special Collections Library in whatever university. And that's where you find the records. And so if you track down those records and do some searches, spend your time searching for records on the internet, as much time searching for records as you do, or even more time than you do searching for individuals. Look for the newspapers and ethnic organizations. A lot of the large immigrant populations had their own newspapers. These are kind of indications or examples of German newspapers, but they're very extensive, and a lot of them are now digitized and available online, but you may need to go to repositories where the newspapers have been preserved. If all else fails and you can't quite come up with any reason to any at all. It is, no matter what you do and where you look and all the places, you never find out where the person came from. The best thing to do is to obtain a DNA test and post it on a family tree on a major DNA website, such as Ancestry or MyHeritage or one of the other large online family tree websites. The reason why it's important to have it on the family tree site is because you have a greater chance of having your matches be people who are already online and on the website. And so, an example, MyHeritage has over 80 million members around the world of their website, users of their website. And most of those are in Europe. And if you have your DNA posted on MyHeritage, it is very likely you will find connections. Ancestry is also a very good place to put your information. Our family had a mystery of years ago that one of my great grandparents was traditionally adopted. We could never find any specific record that indicated that he was adopted. And there were lots of other theories about his origin. And ultimately what happened was we found a possible birth record close to where he was adopted, and began to look at that particular line. And then through DNA found that we were related to his biological parents that we had located. So the connection was made, but the DNA made it so that we were sure that we had actually identified the correct parents of the adopted child. This was in Denmark, by the way, not in the United States. So this is the ultimate, and many of my friends over the years have done this with great success. They may have to go to the country of origin and look for records and relatives. Now, if you've been able to identify the town and you still haven't found any records, it may be a good idea to try to contact people. The best way to do that is to establish those relationships. Once again, is to use a program like MyHeritage that matches you up with cousins in various parts of the world, and lets you contact them directly. And then so you can contact them and say, let's come for a visit. And in a lot of cases, those have been extremely productive. One of the recently, not too long ago, one of my friends indicated that they had gone door to door in the town looking for people that they were related to, and were finally sent to a person who in fact was related and had an extensive pedigree chart of all of the ancestors, which he was glad to share. And so these are kind of success stories of getting on a plane or a boat. Right now, probably not going to work too well, but in the future, perhaps. Now, in any event, no matter what happens, you have to confront the issue that your ancestral line may end. In other words, there just may not be any records. There may not be any way we can work through it at the present time. And the DNA doesn't seem to help, and nothing seems to help. And I would just suggest don't get obsessive about it. The reasons why this can occur are very simple. The person may have changed their name when they came to the country, not just changed it from a translation of a German name or a translation of some other name, but basically changed their name entirely in order to avoid detection. They could have come as an indentured servant, in which case they may have changed their name or not have been properly identified, or could have been an orphan and never had their parents recorded. They could have been an enslaved person. It makes a great difference in the type of investigation you conduct, if this was the case. And transported individuals. We have a tendency in the United States to ignore the fact that a significant percentage of the people who came to America were sent here because they were arrested and criminals and convicted as criminals in European countries, and particularly in England. And we think of Australia being originally inhabited by transported people, but which they celebrate. But we deny this. And when I raised this issue that the ancestor could have been transported, oh no, my ancestor was, he had property, he was rich and famous, and if they were rich and famous, then why can't we find him? But in any event, this is one of the realities of what could happen. And I would suggest that we don't fixate on any of the immigrant. Do the rest of your family research on all your ancestral lines. Don't get hung up on one line for the rest of your life and neglect all the rest of your ancestors. There are plenty of work out there. There's plenty of places to go. And coming back to an ancestor after years of kind of thinking about, well, maybe I can find this. We may now find out that all the records that we thought were impossible have now been located and put online. And so it may now be possible to do that. And I guess my admonition is don't give up, because they didn't. They managed to get here, and they managed to live here, and they managed to have you as part of their descendants. So it's time to remember the immigrants and see what we can do. And just in case you're wondering, all of the photographs that I used in this particular presentation came from Ellis Island portraits taken between 1905 and 1920 by a person named Augustus F. Sherman. And there's a book, and you can go online and see all these really remarkable photographs of the people. They were taken as they got off the boat. So they're not staged. They were just pictures that he took of people that he found in Ellis Island as they came. And it's an amazing collection of showing the diversity of the people who were coming to America through Ellis Island. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Let's see now what we've got from questions. Around 1851, my Irish ancestor embarked from their ship in inland Canada. They immediately crossed over to the US and Michigan through Detroit. Would there be any records in US and Canada available for me to search? The answer is not likely. 1851. Need to look at the date, and you would say that whether or not there's border crossing records or records, you would begin with the earliest record that you could find in the United States and work backwards from that. Or the most recent record you could find in the United States and work back from that. The ship records in Canada and would be possible. But remember this, they were immigrants and they came from Ireland, but they were part of the British Empire, and so was Canada. And so it would be just like moving from one state to another. There's not necessarily, there could be records of their coming there because they did keep records of people moving, but they're not the same as the immigration records that we would think of, because they didn't necessarily have to comply. When they crossed into the United States, that was a different story. If they became citizens of the United States eventually, they had to declare and give up their citizenship with their former country. And so that would be a part. But the hard part here is identifying the place in Ireland, obviously. It's something that we just get into and we start asking questions, and I just start helping and trying to get to the records that might have given that kind of information. And like I say, I found mine on a marriage record, so I don't necessarily rule out any kind of records. Okay, so what else do we have? Anything? Any other questions? Okay, I once again encourage you not to give up, but on the other hand, don't get obsessive. Try to be balanced and spread out and try to find as much information as you can. When did green cards start? I don't know the date, but they didn't start until the 1900s. The length of time that a resident, it's a working card. What the green card signifies is that they were entitled to come in the United States for labor purposes. It was like a temporary visa. So they would come into the country and they would have a period of time at which they could work, and then they would have to renew their permission. And that's probably the same in almost every country of the world now today. At some point in time, they all began that process. I can, probably look it up real quick, but that's basically where the situation is. Okay, anything else? I realized that wasn't the greatest, most satisfying answer, but that's what, that there's the equivalent in almost every country that allows people to come in and work for a period of time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Brother Tanner, for that wonderful webinar about immigrants. And we hope that you will join us next week for a webinar, which will be on December 8th with Catherine Grant on where to start when you don't know where to start. The recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.